They scouted Maine as a touchstone for what the show should look like. They did extensive scouting in Toronto and extensive scouting in Massachusetts, and I have to say, really it was a combination. I'd say it's first and foremost driven by a love of orange they scouted in the deep of winter. So there was a real advantage when you look at the scout photos originally. There was a thick fog rolling in. It was a very gloomy, rainy day. There were no leaves on the trees, and then orange has a very particular look to it. So I'd say the town's rooted in their imaginations, and then that coupled with the realities of having an incentive here where we could start to have it make financial sense was the process.
As Robert Redford would say, film takes place. And for this series, that means the stages that represent a home base, but in a very important way, the place that anchors in these stories, the constant where everything else around it changes. For this purpose, the production chose the quaint and quiet central Massachusetts town of Orange to play a very, very important role, to play the part of Castle Rock, Maine. So here we are a year later, and that's thanks to so many people in this community with a prestigious and much anticipated series. And today we have the good fortune to sit down with key filmmakers from this show who have made the show possible, who've made it into a reality, and who are bringing these stories to life. First, we have the beloved Robin Sweet. She is one of ours. As a producer and production manager, Robin has served a wide variety of film and television projects, ranging from low-budget indie films and award-winning features to studio blockbusters. Robin returns home to Massachusetts from the state of New Mexico, having produced Better Call Saul, the highly acclaimed prequel to Breaking Bad. Currently, Robin is at the helm in her role as producer on Castle Rock, and we could not be happier to have her here. Next to Robin is Michael Uppendahl, a prolific film and television director, originally from Oregon, who has worked on an impressive list of high-profile dramatic series, including Mad Men, American Horror Story, the crime drama series Fargo, and Marvel's Legion, where he also serves as director and co-executive producer. Next to Michael is Colin Walsh. Even though Colin hails from the great state of Rhode Island, we consider him one of our own. Colin started out in locations department on the film Fever Pitch and went on to gather great film and TV credits, including Brotherhood, The Fighter, The Way, Way Back, and Moonrise Kingdom. He then joined the DGA, no small feat, and went on to become the UPM on Better Call Saul and co-producer in UPM on Rectify, both of those with Robin, and now co-producer in UPM on Castle Rock. Next to Colin, we have the very talented Steve Arnold. As an art director, Steve's credits include Get Shorty, Spider-Man, and Appaloosa, and more recently as a production designer on projects such as the critically acclaimed House of Cards, the neo-noir film The Big Bang, and David Fincher's Mindhunter, and currently, of course, the production designer creating in the real world the fictional Castle Rock. And last, but by no means whatsoever the least, is Richard Rutkowski. Working on independent films set Richard firmly on the path towards becoming a cinematographer. He's garnered many prestigious awards for his own films as well as a cinematographer, including Grand Jury Prize at Slamdance for his mini DV film Homework. In recent years, Richard's cinematography has been seen on acclaimed television dramas such as Gus Van Sant's Boss, The Americans, and Manhattan, the latter of which earned him 2 separate ASC nominations for Best Cinematography. Currently, we are fortunate to have Richard here in Massachusetts as the cinematographer on Castle Rock. And that's our panel. Thank you. Let me ask you, just in general, whoever wants to answer this, what it's like to have such a long format to develop stories and characters. And you've all worked on features and television. Maybe this is a question for Michael, what you think the advantages are of having 10 hours to tell a story?
Well, obviously you get to delve much deeper into the story. You don't have to be as focused on a traditional type of story or the way to get it across, and there's a lot more time for sidebar explorations of themes and locations and other characters that you simply don't have time for in the running time of something like that. Right. And you get to really take a little more care and time to really pick over the possibilities narratively and visually.
Mm-hmm. And I actually just read an article about this, but I want to make sure I have this right. Is each season its own story? So this 10 hours would be one story that's based off of a Stephen King story. And the next year, would it be a completely different cast, possibly?
Possibly.
If it was. We're optimists here. We're hoping for, many years.
Theoretically.
Theoretically, I should say. But that's interesting. So that it is contained with that. So the constant is Castle Rock, right?
Yes.
That's pretty neat. Robin, I'd like to ask you, we know there are a variety of producerial roles, and I'm interested what your role is on this show, but also what producers, the different types of producers there are in TV as opposed to features.
Oh, absolutely. So for my role, particularly as a producer, I'm a line producer. I'm a nuts and bolts producer. There are producers that develop the material, that get it financed, get the project greenlit. And usually what that happens, they match up with someone like myself who can help, hopefully, have a say in what pot of money comes to the table. But usually, you're given a pot of money, and it's about taking that money and evaluating what's on the script and figuring out how to put it together, tell the story that's wanting to be told within the resources and the nuts and bolts of strategically, and then drilling down into the nuts and bolts of hiring the crew, where it gets set, et cetera. How film and television differ really is that film is more of a producer's medium in terms of the showrunners, which is a very different producer. The showrunners are usually the creator of the series and the writers of the series, and it's their vision in which we serve, unlike a feature film where you're really serving the vision of a director. So the showrunners are a very important type of producer. Another type of producer that's critical to the process is Mike is our producing director, our co-EP. He has a very specific role as well that I'll let him speak to.
Yeah, so in television, you definitely serve the basic vision of the people who created the show in the first place. And generally, those people continue on as the main writers of the rest of the series. And my role, especially when you're they're in Los Angeles, they're based in Los Angeles. Of course, they come out frequently and oversee the production. But we're the people on the ground who kind of make sure that it's all running the way that it needs to run in order to execute in the best way to our abilities and our resources what they want. And of course, there's a bit of a disparity between what might be on the page and what we're able to do, or we have opportunities that they are unaware of because they're not out here necessarily. So then we communicate frequently with them to make sure that what we think is the best way they agree with, and then we're able to make it happen.
So for you, do you find that you're doing left brain, right brain kind of stuff because you're a director and an executive producer? You're playing both roles. Do those parts of your brain fight each other?
I live mostly in whichever one is the creative side. I let Robin take that.
Oh, you get split, so you got that.
Robin is more split, but I tend to be able to just work on the creative side. I mean, you have to respond to the realities of production and money, right. But people like Robin make it possible for me to wander off into other realms of
That's pretty
process.
Neat. Cool. Colin, I wonder if you could tell us in sort of some practical ways the differences between film and television styles, meaning like, how many days per episode, how many pages a day, that kind of thing, since you've worked both TV and film.
Yeah, I mean, It all depends on the type of film you're shooting. I mean, you know, some small films have pretty aggressive schedules, and some of the bigger films have more leisurely schedules in terms of what they need to accomplish every day. You know, television is anywhere between, you know, every show's different, but 7 days to 12 days to 14 days per episode. Some of the, you know, our show averages about 10 to 11 days per episode, I'd say. But other shows we've done, I mean, Better Call Saul is 8 to 9 days an episode. You know, the big difference is you're trying to generate an hour of content or 45 minutes of content in 10 or 11 days, where with a feature you've got a lot more time to shoot it. So it's an aggressive schedule, and I think the crew here is getting used to it. I think the first couple episodes were a bit of a reality check for what we're hoping to accomplish versus some of the larger features that have shot in Boston recently. So it is more aggressive. You know, you get a script, a director shows up, usually 7 to 8 days out, and you've got 7 to 8 days to sort of read the script, break it down, deliver a budget, come up with a schedule, and then start shooting. And with a feature, you have, you know, I mean, Moonrise Kingdom, I think we started prep 16 to 18 weeks out for one feature. So it's a very different schedule, and it has its pros and cons for sure.
That was one of my questions, if there was a learning curve for our crew here, having done all features. You know, there certainly seem to be pros and cons to both film and television, depending on what you want. Would you say that you're preferring one over the other these days?
Personally, or?
Personally.
I guess I prefer television these days, you know. There's more opportunity, and there's more interesting shows being made, you know. Right. 10 years ago, or even, I don't know how many years ago it was, 8 years ago, I was doing Body of Proof in Rhode Island, and that was not interesting at all. Some of the shows I've been working on recently have been very interesting. Yeah,
so that makes sense, good. Just like anything else, if it's the content is interesting to you. Speaking of the location, how did Orange get chosen?
I would say the genesis of that was one of the early scouts that you probably helped facilitate here in Massachusetts. There was a canvassing of states and countries and where to place it, because Toronto was on the map. They have competitive incentives and favorable exchange rates. So usually what you do and what happened here is you identify certain locations that you think could work, and then you land on the ground and you scout. I wasn't involved in the original scouts, but I know that JJ came out with the two showrunners, Sam and Dusty, as well as the head of television at Bad Robot. They scouted Maine as a touchstone for what the show should look like. They did extensive scouting in Toronto and extensive scouting in Massachusetts, and I have to say, really it was a combination. I'd say it's first and foremost driven by a love of Orange and they scouted in the deep of winter. So there was a real advantage when you look at the scout photos originally. There was a thick fog rolling in. It was a very gloomy, rainy day. There were no leaves on the trees, and then Orange has a very particular look to it. So I'd say the town's rooted in their imaginations, and then that coupled with the realities of having an incentive here where we could start to have it make financial sense was the process.
Right. That's
here. There are components we've had to go outside of Massachusetts for, which is not uncommon, but you know, there, as you saw the car going down, you saw the Shawshank sticker. There is a Shawshank prison, and we had to look again all over Canada and the United States searching for the exact right prison. So there have been pieces that we've had to carve out and shoot elsewhere, which is not uncommon in an incentive state, especially when you're shooting for other locations.
Boy, we looked for that prison. We tried everything.
Yes. We had many conversations and emails.
Right,
that was exhausting.
Tim Bradford worked really hard on that. We tried so hard. We wanted to have Shawshank here, but you know, everything you just said just reiterates to me how fortunate we are to have you here, because we do it's pretty tough with Toronto. I got to say that exchange rate is really kicking our butts in some circumstances. So we're so honored that you ended up here, and thank God for Orange, Massachusetts. And I'm wondering, Richard, if you had to, ever since that scout, have you had to create that fog and that look?
I've done my best.
You've done your best.
I'm looking forward to seeing what was seen originally.
That's great. That's cool. And Steve, I wondered if you could tell us about creating the look on this show, and particularly of the town. Like, what makes Castle Rock Castle Rock?
Well, it's described as being, you know, a town that has sort of gone to seed, and Orange is not exactly gone to seed, but kind of leaning that way. So we just kind of amplified that a bit, worked on that a little bit. It's got some really great architecture there, some really great buildings, some really great houses. We looked for, there's a particular set of houses there that we looked for in other places closer to where we are in Devon's, and just could not get that same quality. And we found a couple of really great ones there. And I do a lot with the color palette. We're trying to make this, you know, have that Maine, in Stephen King's mind, kind of special place where maybe some bad things happen. And so it's a process. It's the contrast between, as others have mentioned, between doing TV and film is quite a bit. You know, I have, on a film, you have one director, normally. One script, normally. And you sort of have that somewhere near the beginning so that you know what you're kind of up against. And that isn't always the case in television. I think flexibility and being able to move quickly and make quick decisions is something that I'm learning to do, because it's a different way of working, and you have to be resourceful as much as possible, and time is of the essence.
Right, absolutely. Colin, I'm just wondering, in terms of yourself and your location managers, once Orange was picked, I mean, I did go to one of those town meetings. How have you communicated with the town? This could go on, obviously, for this period of time. It could go on for years, possibly. How have you dealt with them on that notion?
I mean, the locations department has really dealt with the town directly, but you know, we had meetings and just explained to the town and our locations department, that's mostly local and does mostly feature films, that, you know, this is a place where we could end up being for 10 years. There's television shows in other states that have, you know, been in towns for 10 plus years, and you sort of have to deal with it differently than a feature would, where you go in for 5 days and shoot and leave. So Alex Berard, who's a local location manager, has sort of been our Orange person, and we affectionately refer to him as the mayor of Orange, because he sort of goes there every day and just knows all the business owners and knows all the selectmen and knows everybody, and has done a great job of really interfacing with the town and keeping people really happy, and it's been a good experience. I mean, it's far out there, but shooting there has been great. They've been super accommodating, and I think they've been really happy with us as a production shooting there.
That's certainly what I'm getting.
It's worth noting that they hadn't really had much film when we first came in there, and Lisa was really instrumental in helping communicate and broker between us and them this idea of what's a film permit. How do you structure communicating production's desires to be in any given place at any given time? And so there's a little infrastructure that we also had to work to build up because we were pioneering new territory.
It's funny, the day that I was out there with Alex Berard in your location department, I was so impressed because your crew was just so gracious, accommodating, had a really good feeling. I felt like they expressed really clearly what to expect. There's times, I can't remember who said it, maybe it was you, there are going to be times where you look a little worse than you normally do. And then there's times where you look better than you do. I'm not sure which one is harder to take, you know? But that kind of honesty and then just working through it, I think they see it as something very special. I think that they're really touched by that. I'm kind of expecting to see at some point a tourism effect, which I don't know if you see that happening, like Castle Rock Coffee or who knows what.
I have seen Castle Rock Coffee. Dean's Beans. Do you know there's a local Dean's Beans? I think in the local commissary in Orange is selling Castle Rock postcards and Castle Rock coffees. There's a local house that has the fact that we shot there listed on their sales listing. So people are very quickly getting entrepreneurial.
That's going to work. Even if someone gets killed in that thing, it's still going to be good for them, right?
Even better.
Right, even better.
Even better.
Thank you. So, Michael, I'm really interested to know how it was directing the pilot episode. And how do you set the tone, the psychological tone, in that first episode?
Well, obviously, you base it a lot on the script. I mean, I've talked extensively with Sam and Dusty, are the two gentlemen who wrote the script. Of course, it comes from Stephen King, so there's a lot of research going into Stephen King's world. We're veering away from it. There's no, we're not directly recreating something that already exists, and so we had a lot of discussions about how to take the more successful versions of Stephen King, which there are several, and not fall into the traps of some of the less successful Stephen King adaptations. And especially Steve and Richard and I talked a lot about trying to figure out a new approach rather than to just kind of ape a style or a combination of styles from just a very finite amount of influences. We took a larger amount of influences in order to try and create a palette of expression that we thought was at least somewhat new. I mean, we weren't looking to necessarily reinvent the wheel, but we didn't want to just kind of trot along on ground that was already there. So we tried to take a wide range of influences and then come up with our own in a way that was something that is tangible enough that we could repeat from episode to episode, because they are very different. We have 10 episodes and they're quite different from each other. So we want them to feel of a piece but not constricted by a hard set of rules that can't be bent.
Right. And how about working with the actors on the pilot episode? You're setting things up. It must be very different than when you get down the road and they're established in their personalities and so forth. So you're helping them create that persona?
Yes, I mean, my approach is always to take what the actors are bringing and work from that. I don't like to impose a whole lot of, I feel like you can get into falsehoods really quickly in a foundational level if you try and impose too much on something that's not native to the performer. So I like to try and take their lead and see what they're giving and then just kind of play around a little bit to play in the kind of mid-ranges and make sure that without betraying the honesty that they're bringing, that maybe certain facets should be highlighted more than others, and to try and create an environment where they feel safe and happy and able to perform well. I mean, I think with all actors, there's always a real danger that they could look like a schmuck on screen, you know? And a lot of that, when they feel pushed in a way that they don't want to be pushed, a lot of them will do it because the director's telling them to do it, but then you start to really hollow out their gifts, and they start to become guarded, and and then you've injected a bad thing in the creative spine.
Wow. And so along the lines of, creating this atmosphere, Richard, how have you approached this show in terms of camera and lighting to create a certain vibe?
Well, I'll start by saying we have wonderful actors. We have really great actors. And I don't think there's a day that I look at the material on the screen and don't say, well, I'm really blessed that these people are performing these roles. We did a lot of talking and a lot of looking at things in the early going. It's interesting because I've done a lot of period work now. So to work in modern day presented a sort of new opening to me of like, now I don't have to worry about what's in the background as much. I don't have to fuss with cars. People are going to be on cell phones. And that was both a blessing and a curse because a lot of the horror genre relies on a kind of historical dread, and some of our storytelling relies on multi-decades of period in history of this kind of bad luck or bad karma or bad juju that this town has. And the town is a character. So I sort of started with the idea of like, well, what is fear? What is nature? Is nature for man or against man? And then from that, working with Mike and Steve, we went through visual, references, and then you sort of develop a palette, and you sort of develop a certain, sensibility of like, how much color, how little color, and trying not to ape, horror lighting, not always ghoulish underlighting, but at the same time getting ready for it. So I guess that's a long-winded answer to a short question.
No, it was a great answer. And I'm interested, Steve and Richard, how you collaborate, what's your process with each other?
We pass each other on a stairwell quite frequently.
That's about it?
Yeah, we bump into each other. Steve is great to work with because Steve is very, very, very on his game. In fact, as you mentioned, his credits vastly outclass me, but I like working with him regardless. Steve is very clear and direct on what can or can't be accomplished in certain situations, and I'm very adaptable. So,
and we discuss a lot of lighting elements, let's say, because a lot of times you're using practical lights that are not movie lights to do a scene or to at least establish the look of a scene. And so we'll go back and forth, and can I use a G9 bulb here or whatever, or would you prefer I use a fluorescent instead of an incandescent? And we go back and forth and discuss all of that. And a lot of those, over the years, I've found that a lot of, with working with David Fincher, a lot of the lights in a set are very, very critical.
They set the mood.
They set the mood, and they set the style, and so I've kind of come to, and Steven Soderbergh is the same way. Lights are built into the set, and there's not so much old school big movie light things.
In the world of 800 and 1,000 ASA, units that are part of the set become a big deal, and units that are just out in the street become a big deal. So even when it came to talking about color, part of color for me was talking about trying to use mercury vapor lights outside at night instead of sodium vapor lights, and that just came down to color and sensibility. One of the great things working with Steve is this discussion doesn't have so much to do with aesthetics because he and I are aligned aesthetically. It's not an argument over an aesthetic choice. It's down right away, and thankfully, because as Steve mentioned, there's time pressures to dealing with practical considerations for how to get these sets to look right from their inherent lighting. I'm unable to name drop amazing directors, so I'll just name drop sconces are helpful. And sometimes a desk lamp has been used to great effect, and I've occasionally had a bare bulb, but.
Something I think is always on our mind because we're in the age of incentives. We're in the age of competing on every show with the 38 other states, the Canadian provinces. We're all around the globe. So it's one of these things that for years, leading up to this, hoping that we would get a TV series, we've talked about the impact that it may have. It's different from features economically. What would you all say you see as the impact, the type of impact that's first on the town? How is the town affected, would you say?
I think the town is affected simply because of our presence there. I mean, even when we have offset shooting crews, they're prepping our locations, they're buying lunch at the local restaurants, there's just a constant influx of money in some way in terms of the food establishments. They're local homeowners who are getting location fees either because we're shooting there or we're putting our cast in their living room or we just don't want to inconvenience them at night. So there's a real economic impact, which I remember when I did The Help in Greenwood, Mississippi, because it was a very similar small town. They actually tracked $50 bills because per diems to out-of-town employees were paid in $50 bills. And so they actually tracked the circulation of $50 bills and saw that it rose enormously, as well as food and liquor sales. So I think it's probably similar in Orange and surrounding towns where we do, and Colin can speak to this more, because Orange is so far out. When we shoot there, we house our cast and crew closer to Orange. Not in Orange. I think the closest hotel to Orange is still a 40-minute drive. But there's a residual effect that sort of there's Orange's epicenter and then it works its way out in terms of just the money that's being spent for us to run our production. And then you add to that, as you mentioned before, possible, tourist and look-see-loos. I think what Colin was referring to previously is the impact of The Walking Dead on Sequoia, Sonoya. Yeah, in Georgia, and it's been tremendous.
I actually saw that.
And we also have used local vendors there, antique dealers, people like that, where we've purchased locally from them, and that's helpful for us, and I'm sure very helpful for them.
It is really helpful, and some of it is more psychological than that dollar amount. It matters that on some shows we've had here, there's been a real push to, if you need office supplies, go to the office supply place there. It means a lot. People feel part of your project when you buy or you use their businesses and services. And then in another way too, maybe not in the first season, but am I correct that in television you have a higher number generally of local hires than you do on like, say, a large feature, would you say?
Oh, definitely. We certainly bring in people for the department heads and those who are architecting the look, but Massachusetts does have such a deep bench, so to speak, and we've been able to hire locally more than we had thought that we might be able to, which was a great experience. And yes, you just don't have the budget. I mean, we'll be a 6-month run. So you really just don't have the budget to pay the premium to bring people in. And so it is, there is a reliance on local hires. And the idea is that as we go on, they return year after year. I mean, the crew I work with on Better Call Saul is a crew that I've been working with since I started there. There's a 2%, 3% maybe shift in employment on that show because you develop a family type atmosphere and that becomes a long relationship.
Right. I've always thought of it as a good place for training to take place, or at least moving people up seems to happen a fair amount from, if, knock on wood, I need wood somewhere, somebody knock on wood, let's say there's 2, 3, 4, 5 years of this. If some people get the chance to move up, then there's a chance for new people to come in. And it's certainly in states that have a lot of TV, you see that going on. And that's partly how they're growing their crew base is through television. So that's pretty great.
We have a terrific crew.
I'm so
We
glad
have a
to hear
terrific crew. And as much as there are members of the crew that are developing on this show, there's members of this crew who developed me, literally, because I started working here in 1989-90. And some of the same grips and electricians and sound people and camera persons that I dealt with when I really was just starting are now part of the environment of what we're doing. So I feel really good about that.
That's really cool to hear. A question for you, Richard. I was looking up your background, and you have a strong background in experimental film. Do you have a way to work experimentally on television? Is there a way to do that?
No one's figured it out, but I do.
I have a feeling if anyone could figure it out, it might be you.
Oh, no. What I meant is, yes, I try to put something a little eccentric into the works. I don't think I'm here to make any other TV show than the one we're making. And into each scene, if I'm given the opportunity, I will usually be the one suggesting something odd or oddball or unusual or trying to point something in a direction that has a dissonance to it. Making an experimental film and making a TV show are very different. Right. The expectation of the audience, and right now, TV has become indie film. I can't see any other way around it. I started in indie film, and I made a bunch of indie films, and suddenly all the people I knew were going into TV, and I really noticed it when the caterers shifted over to TV. You had these caterers on films, big films, and now they're doing the TV shows. So then I knew it was like all there. But I do like the idea that on this show we're given license by our showrunners and by Mike to try something different and to not get in a repetitious pattern of the standard procedural. I mean, I remember early on in the days of Law and Order, it was like this first season of Law and Order, and Ernest Dickerson was shooting it, and I'd go in as a camera assistant, and they had every shot figured out already because they were always the same shots, because it was a 4:3 frame, and you knew there was going to be X, Y, and Z coverage, and we really try not to do that as best as possible. So in that can be experimental. That's what we're doing.
Right. That's what I was hoping for, because
I'm
it
glad
makes
to please
sense to I mean, it's a unique feeling to this content, right? So to have something innovative, have something a little different, oddball, sounds proper, right? So that's pretty neat.
It's one of the ways we're able to find the kind of, when I was talking before about trying to find something that's relatively unique between the various departments, is when we are able to, you find something that really is exciting and kind of new and different, and then that feels right, and you can see it go all the way down the whole crew. And then when the next one comes along, there's a familiarity to the feeling behind it. It might not be the same kind of idea, but there's something that's like, right, that's a baton tossed from, or passed from what we did before. So that's how we try to develop a new language for ourselves.
It's such an interesting thing that you must be dealing with, being true to the genesis of these stories, but also breathing new life into them. Pardon me. Whoa, did I just blow your ears out? I'm sorry. I just wonder how you find that balance, keeping true to the past, but bringing something new and growing new life into the characters and the stories themselves.
A lot of it really happens on the day. I mean, a lot of the work that you're talking about has happened before in the writing of it and in our talks about it communally, of everyone here in our entire crew, where we've kind of discussed the basic ideas that we want to try and hit, but you really only have, when you actually get down to it and you're on the day and you're shooting, you have to make the call then and there, and you don't really think. On occasion, you might think this is a more Stephen King way to go if you've got two possibilities that are even. You might get tipped over in one way, but generally speaking, that's already taken care of, and so you're already set up for it, and so you just try and find what's the most honest way to execute it at that time.
That makes sense.
I mean, a lot happens in the 7-day prep. It's pretty outrageous. But if you think about it, there's a new director coming in for each episode. So you have to, all this work that Mike and Steve and Richard did for the pilot, that thread has to be pulled through. And that's one of Mike's jobs, but also there's a lot of communication with the writers, there's a lot of communication with the departments, and something that's, I think, it's a very structured prep because it happens so quickly relative to film, and something that is very particular to TV, not just our show, but is very important, is you have what you call a tone meeting, which can last anywhere from 2 hours to, I've been in one that has lasted as long as 12 hours. But you're essentially doing a page turn with the director and the writer of the script, and in that you're asking yourself all these tonal questions. And it happens towards the end of the prep process where you've sort of addressed all the elements in the script and you've gotten the ball rolling on all of that. But you sit down before you set the ship a sail and you really ask yourself about the tone, and you talk about it and you bring the director up to speed. They share their ideas. Mm-hmm. You make sure their ideas kind of fit within the gestalt of the whole. And then the ship sets a sail, and I think you can move a little more intuitively at that point.
Yeah, I mean, that's the idea. Is that, and
In a
it's
perfect
been
world.
working well. I mean, we're set up very well. Robin and Colin and everyone has set up our entire situation so that we can, on the day, really make the decision. One of the most exciting things about getting to work in film in any iteration is that you really have to make quick decisions, and a lot of action immediately follows once you pull the trigger on one tiny little decision and all the other decisions. And if you're set up properly, it can be kind of a really fun and very ineffable thing where things just start to feel right. You feel the whole crew knowing that this is the right way it should go without anyone having to articulate it because of all the prep that you've already done.
Right. What's the interaction with Stephen King and J.J. Abrams? Do they through the showrunners or directly to any one of you?
Essentially through the showrunners. And yeah, both Stephen and JJ operate through Sam and Dusty, and that informs their process and filters down through to us.
That's interesting. And are Sam and Dusty in Massachusetts, or are they in LA, or do they come here?
On occasion.
But they're based in LA. The writing room is in LA. The post-production is in LA.
Right.
So they're largely preoccupied there. They come out
Yeah.
and,
That's
from time to
interesting.
time.
Depends on how badly we need a script.
Well, I just had a couple of other questions, practical things. So how this is going to roll out, I asked you right before this. Is it going to be all at once when it comes out next year? Will it be week to week, or what do you think will happen?
I don't think we know. I know they're targeting a spring 2008 release. And there's many ways to do it, as we all know. You drop all 10, like Netflix or Hulu dropped The Handmaid's Tale, I think the first 3, and then continued on the series. So I don't think Hulu's fully committed to what approach that they'll take.
Right, that's
I
interesting.
think they're a little less
out.
eager to do all at once.
Mm-hmm.
They're not as into the Netflix way.
Yeah.
But who knows? We'll see.
And is it different working for streaming than it is, say, cable or certainly network? Is there more flexibility on how long things are, when things are coming out?
Yes. I mean, they're all different. There's generally less of an infrastructure in the streaming services, and there's less of the tyranny of runtime is not as big a deal. But that's getting now true of cable as well, where it used to be, 42 and a half minutes no matter what. And now everybody's leaning towards more flexibility in that regard, where you can go a little longer, a little shorter to try and serve the story, because it really did hurt a lot of things to try and, you would have to vacuum out things and all the pauses and whole characters and scenes just to kind of make it happen. And you'd be shooting things that you just throw in the river at the end because there's just no time for it. And sometimes it is better to be a little shorter, and you would have the opposite problem of, well, let's just drag this out a little bit because we got to get 42 and a half some way.
That's pretty neat, though. I like that.
Yeah, I'd also say the difference, I mean, the reason why TV is better, in my humble opinion, is that some of the traditional TV processes have become more hybrid to the filmmaking process. And I think that streaming and cable have helped open that up in terms of doing a 10-episode order versus a 20-plus episode order allows you to take more time and craft, opening the writer's room up earlier, giving longer lead times to the writers, taking a model where you're not editing and delivering episodes while you're shooting, which is a typical network model. The whole process has been opened up where you're shooting and there's still pressure to deliver episodes, and we're still delivering episodes, but a much larger portion of the post-process happens afterwards, so that the showrunners can really be more involved as they pull their way through. Whereas the more compressed network model, the showrunners are writing while cuts are being made and it's being delivered, and so it becomes less, it's just less handmade. I don't know how to say it.
The factory floor that used to feel like it was when you were making television for broadcast delivery has become a little bit more the atelier. You feel like you're making something that whole cloth is going to be viewed as a complete piece, instead of, as Robin was saying, something that literally has to deliver to a broadcaster in 8 to 10 days. So that's a very different mentality. I got very used to that kind of quick turnaround and going in on weekends and color correcting because you knew it was going to air very soon. And I think it's a really big change now, the approach to making the thing that is eventually going to get seen. And of course, things like Steve's show, House of Cards, have utterly changed the expectation of audiences as to what they're going to get, how they're going to get it, how long it's going to be in their lives. It's very different than this week's episode of MASH or Family or something. So.
Right. Is there anything you can tell us that you think that Massachusetts could do better? We're all learning, we're growing. That's a tricky question, but how, we're in the kind of community that wants to support you in every possible way. And if there are things that we do well, we'd love to hear that. If there are things that we need to improve upon or needs that you have that we might be able to supply, we would do everything to help you.
I would let Colin speak to this, but I feel like there could be a bit more specialized equipment here on the ground, like insert cars, cranes. We get around that by sharing them. If Equalizer's holding a 50-foot Techno, then we try to pull it off of them. But if we're not in luck, we have to bring that equipment up. It becomes more burdensome. We can react less to last-minute changes. That's one thing to come to mind. I don't know if you have other thoughts, Colin.
That's a good one, though.
I mean, you guys do a lot very, very well.
Nice.
I'm reaching for straws.
No, I mean, I agree. It's great shooting here. The crew's great. These new stages we're in are great, which is a huge deal for us because it makes, especially being in Orange and having that facility is wonderful. More equipment and sort of, more vendors would be the only, downside I'd say here. And it's, hopefully Castle Rock is the beginning of more consistent year-round work that would, trigger vendors to come up here and keep equipment here, techno cranes, camera houses, all sorts of equipment that we use regularly that we have to go to New York for, which is, it's a scheduling thing. It's an expense to be sending drivers down there. It takes them, sometimes you have a driver on for 3 days to go pick up a piece of equipment that in LA, New York, Atlanta, it's a one-day thing. You pick it up in the morning, you use it, you send it back. So that is something that would be great if it changed here, insert cars, techno cranes, all that type of specialty equipment. But generally speaking, it's been really great, and the crew's been great, and I think they're enjoying the experience on Castle Rock.
But that's perfect. I mean, there has to be an entrepreneur out there who sees the need for that, and if it's here, it's going to be used.
Yeah, but I mean, to be honest, all our trailers are from Above the Line, which is a local vendor. Our lighting packages are from local vendors. Our grip packages are local vendors. most of the stuff is local. It's just the specialty equipment that is a challenge for us.
Great. Well, I wonder if we could, I don't know how much time we have, but can we take a few questions? You okay with that? I can't see very well is the problem. Yes, sir.
As much as I'd like to think that Massachusetts was your first and only choice, where else did you look?
Well, Maine. But there's no incentive or film infrastructure in Maine. Toronto mainly. It was mainly Toronto, and I think that you start by narrowing down incentive states. That's what you do. There's a handful of incentive states, and you immediately think about which one might serve your location. And there was a strong studio drive for Toronto. Our money would have gone further in Toronto, but it was the look of Massachusetts and the ability to create an authentic Maine that tipped the balance here.
We love that. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I can project. My question is about actors. One of the things I found most exciting, and there's so many, about having a series here is the opportunities it would create for local actors. I've met lots of people from markets like Atlanta or New Mexico who are able to have, a real career working regularly. So I was wondering to what degree you've done any local hire casting at this point, and how you would see pulling in the local community if we were blessed to have this go forward for a long time.
We've cast a lot of local actors, and I've personally been very happy with the pool of actors that we have, or that you have here. It's been really impressive. I've worked in a lot of different places where you always try to cast locally, and then frequently you end up just casting the very small one-line kind of roles, and that's it. But there's a strong pool here. Some are here right now. It's Richard there, who we had the pleasure of working with. It's been really terrific. And the other thing, I don't really know what has brought the caliber of acting up around here, but there's definitely a widespread excellence in a surprising number of people. And that pairs with just looks that you don't necessarily see as often when you're in Los Angeles or New York. So when you want to have, people always say, can we have someone who doesn't have yoga arms and perfect teeth? And, and it's hard to get in Los Angeles. I worked on Mad Men for years. We had a no yoga arms policy. And
I've never heard that.
it's very hard to do in LA. And a lot of excellent actors have, they look a certain kind of way for very, not necessarily good reasons, but understandable reasons in those markets. So it's nice to be able to have people who look different than you really kind of realize how similar a lot of people look when you're able to draw from a pool of good talent that is just from a different part of the nation.
Wow, that's great to hear.
Yeah, I would also say in terms of local communities, we did casting calls in Orange, particularly for extras casting, and it made the news. The turnout, it created a traffic jam in downtown Orange, although it doesn't take much to create a traffic jam in downtown Orange.
We do it all the time.
We do it all the
Yes,
time.
A bunch of idiots wandering around pointing at buildings.
So we've done a lot of community outreach in that way to involve the town, going back to a previous question as well, and give them opportunities to actually be a part of the process and get on screen.
Fantastic, that's great. Yes?
What's it going to take to get a writer's room in Boston? Because we've been talking about all these different parts of the puzzle and that are locally based, or you can hire locally. And there's a lot of great talent that's part of Massachusetts' deep bench in that field, and a lot of people who draw their stories and their strength from this area and don't necessarily want to move their families or can't move their families to LA or New York. And I'm just sort of wondering, just the beginning of a possible next wave on that level too.
Sure. I mean, I think it would take someone selling a script and insisting on staying here. It's the same thing that happens in LA. I mean, the same reasons that you're saying, people don't necessarily want to move, that's why they're in LA. I mean, these people who happen to create this show and many other shows are in LA, New York, or wherever they are, but sometimes, it can certainly happen. A lot of it is the post situation, which I can't really speak to. I believe you have ample facilities here, and it's certainly possible. It's just a matter of kind of who gets to make the show and what their demands are.
I would also say one of the challenges, because no matter where you shoot the writer's room, the structure is the writer's room is in LA, and post is usually in LA. And I'm not saying that that can't be broken, but it's rare that those localize. And some of that's also driven by access to studio and network, because you're still pitching out the series, you have notes, you have meetings. The writers are now sharing the time between post. You have a writer's room of 10 people. I mean, to move those two departments onto location, right now, the benefits would be over, the challenges would outweigh the benefits, really. And so a lot of that is just driven by access to studio network.
How about in New York? Does a writer's room in New York, or are they still in LA sometimes?
There are some in New York.
Yeah, I've worked on 2 shows that were based out of New York with writers' rooms and post and everything like that.
They're mostly in LA. I think everything I've worked on is based in LA. And most of them haven't shot in LA, but that's where it is.
Yes, sir.
Hello? Yeah, I want to thank you guys for coming and sharing your experience. It's been fantastic. I got 2 questions. One is, could you give us some numbers about how the size of your crew, how many local, how many out of town? And the other question is, for you, Richard, what format are you shooting on and why?
We're shooting in 4K, which was mandated by Hulu and seems to be the new standard. We're shooting in a 2-to-1 aspect ratio, which Mike and I both fought for. And I think if there's maybe a 3 basic visual architecture moments to how this thing came together, the 2-to-1 ratio is definitely one of them. And that's enabled by the popularity of download now and the competition between download and cable. I think our crew, I think I see roughly 80 people in my dreams at night, and then most of them are on set. I mean, I don't know, is it 80?
No, I mean, not including background artists, I'd say we have between 250 and 350 people. When we started and we were building all our stages, our construction department was significantly larger. So that was probably, at the height of it, 350 people, not including background artists. Currently, I think it's probably, around 250 that we employ between all the different departments, on-set, off-set, production, accounting, everything. But it's a pretty big operation.
But only 80 and Derek haunt me. So.
Richard only pays attention to 80. And I'd say, what would you say, Colin, maybe 30 of those are distant hires?
Yeah, I mean, we really don't have very many distant hires overall. We expected to bring in a lot more people when we started, but a lot of our grip electric camera team are local, a lot of our locations department, all sorts of people. So I'd say 30 people at most are distant hires at this point.
We've had to bring in, just to go back, we've had to bring in a lot of construction people. We haven't, into the way we have to build and the time that we have to get sets up, that's a place where we've had to augment our construction crew fairly consistently in order just to meet the appetite of what we're doing. And we're rapidly, honestly, I feel like if I could have that 4th stage at New England Studios. So we're a little tight on space. So I do think that that's something in terms of looking ahead in Massachusetts for continued television production and even thinking about having more than one production here simultaneously. There is an infrastructure there that there's an appetite to be fed, for sure.
And that's a positive. And I think it's, every jurisdiction goes through this. You want to grow, but you don't want to grow too fast or have too many people who are then on unemployment. But, I think the next 6 months to a year are going to be really interesting to see where Massachusetts goes. And I think everyone in this room would agree with me that we hope that next year will involve you and that you will be in Massachusetts once again And thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate you.
Thank you.